Mr. President, this week, this body is talking about one of the most serious problems facing our country. The word epidemic really isn't strong enough to represent what we are seeing in terms of drug addiction, opioids and heroin in particular. The bipartisan support for the bill that's on the floor this week is an indication of the belief of members of both parties, of all parties, of all parts of the country, that this is a critically important question. We've heard in committees, in caucuses, and on the floor the appalling figures. In just the state of Maine, 200 deaths a year from overdoses, an 8-fold increase in the last 3 years. The figure that got my attention most dramatically was that in Maine, a year ago, we had 12,000 babies born, and of that number, over 950 were addicted to a substance. That's almost 1 in 12 babies born in my state. Nationally, the figures are just as shocking and just as bad. In my neighboring state of New Hampshire, the number of overdose deaths is now over 380 a year, more than one a day. Nationally, 47,000 overdose deaths. 47,000. More deaths than are caused by automobiles. Think, Mr. President, if this were Ebola or ISIS or any other kind of national crisis, we would be in 24-hour session to find a solution. We would be doing everything the equivalent of the Manhattan Project to deal with something that's killing so many of our citizens, particularly our young people. Like any other problem that gets to this body, this is complicated. There isn't any single solution. It involves law enforcement. It involves national security, stopping drugs at the border. It involves treatment of mental illness. It involves treatment of drug addiction and figuring out what works. It involves figuring out prevention. It involves dealing with I believe, the overwhelming number of opioid prescription drugs that we now know lead to heroin and other addiction. So that it is a very complex problem. There is no single answer. But there are some things we do know about this problem. Number one, law enforcement alone isn't enough. We essentially have tried that for 25 years. Law enforcement alone isn't enough. It's important. It's a critical part of our defense against this scourge, but it is not the entire answer. The second thing we know is that this epidemic is directly related to the dramatic rise of prescription painkillers based upon opioids. The data is that 4 out of 5 new heroin users started with prescription drugs. This is something that we need to discuss. We need to discuss with the medical community. We need to discuss with the medical education community. And we need to understand when these drugs are prescribed, there are risks. Serious, undeniable, dangerous risks that are taking an enormous toll on our society. 4 out of 5 new heroin users started with prescription drugs. I met a young man in Maine who was in treatment, who was trying to recover, who had become an addict, and he got there starting with a high school sports injury. And he was prescribed opioid treatment, opioid pills, and he ended up in the drug culture that was destroying his life. So that's the second thing that we know. We know that law enforcement isn't enough. We know that a big part of our focus has to be on opioids and prescription drugs. The third thing we know is there are some treatments that appear to work. appear to work. We don't know for sure, and one of the things that I think we need to do in this body is to provide for the research and the data sharing and the data collection from around the country so we can find out what works. It appears that medication and counseling together are something that works. But we need more research and more data. Number 4 of things we know, treatment resources are grossly inadequate. This epidemic has exploded in the last few years, but the resources in terms of treatment have, in some cases, actually diminished. There are fewer beds today than there were 3 years ago because of budget cuts, because of policy changes, and we end up with young people and people generally that have this terrible problem eating up their lives with no place to go. The greatest tragedy is when we have someone who's suffering from addiction, who wants treatment and is ready to take the step and say, I need it, and there's no place to go. The estimates are that among teenagers that are caught in this trap, only 20% have treatment available to them. But all these numbers and statistics and policy prescriptions aren't really my subject today. I don't want to talk about politics or even policy. I want to talk about people. And in particular, I want to talk about this little boy. This picture is of a young man from Maine named Garrett Brown. And there was an extraordinary story in the Bangor Daily News earlier this week, or late last week, about Garrett, where a reporter and editor at the Bangor Daily News, one of our great newspapers, Aaron Rhoda, got to know this young man, Garrett Brown, and spent a lot of time interacting with him over the last 3 years and recounted it in this extraordinary piece of journalism. And it's the story of this young man's attempts to survive and what happened in his life. This isn't politics, it isn't policy, it's people. In reading this story, and I sat in my darkened office late last week as my staff went home. They thought there was something wrong with me. The lights were dimming, the sun was setting, and I read this story. And it was like reading the story of the Titanic or of the Lincoln assassination. You knew how it was going to come out, but you hoped it wouldn't happen. And you kept seeing moments when it could have been avoided, the tragic end could have been avoided, but it didn't happen. And that was what was so gripping to me about this story. It was so real and it was so close to home. I would venture to say, I've got 4 boys of my own. Every family in America that has a son has this picture or a picture just like it somewhere in their family scrapbooks or stored on their telephone or in their computer. This is a wonderful Maine kid. Smiling, 8 years old, happy, with his backpack ready to go to school. And then, about 15 years later, he's with his mom, and he's on his way out. He had a mom who loved him, but he had a system who failed him. He took responsibility, by the way. He said, it's not that my mom or my stepdad didn't care. They tried. My grandparents, they tried everything they could. They were devout Christians. There was nothing they could have done to change it. He took responsibility. But when he took responsibility, we didn't provide the means for him to effectuate that and save his own life. He had to want to beat it. But he also had to have the means, the resources, to take that step. The Bangor News, I think, quite accurately laid out the issue. Opioid addiction like Garrett's requires treatment. We have this idea in our society that people can it's just a choice. You make the choice. You don't have to take that pill. Well, the way these drugs work on your brain, they hijack the very parts of your brain that enable you to make that decision. They actually go to the parts of the brain that deal with executive function, decision-making, and fear, and they derail those parts. It requires treatment. Very rarely, occasionally I'm sure there are people who can do this by themselves, but very rarely. Requires treatment, but the odds are that people with an addiction to drugs or alcohol won't get any treatment at all. As I mentioned, only 1 out of 5 teenagers who needs treatment has it available. If they do, they're likely to get the wrong treatment. There are lots of worlds of different theories of treatment, and that's why I say we need to have the research so we understand what works, and we put our resources into the things that actually will bring results. Often, it means they die, and that's what happened to young Garrett. Between 2010 and 2014, the number of overdose deaths in Maine involving heroin increased 8-fold. This is Maine. And this could be any state in the country. It seems to be striking rural states now as strongly or even worse than urban areas of the country. I didn't know Garrett Brown, but he was a brave kid. I could tell it by his conversations with Aaron Rhoda, by his conversations with us. He knew he was talking to us. He knew this was going to be public. He knew that he was communicating, and here's what he said: if this changes one kid's life, saves one kid from being in jail, saves his family the pain of seeing him go through this. This is a guy in addiction saying this. It's extraordinary. If it saves one kid from overdosing and dying, then all that I have done hasn't been in vain. I guess that's why I keep doing this with you, he said to the reporter. Mr. President, this is a tragedy. It's not a tragedy of numbers, it's a tragedy of real people. It's a tragedy of young lives lost, of treasure squandered, and of hearts broken. I have never in my adult life seen a problem like this that's facing my state and every state in this country. We can't solve it all at once. There's no magic wand. But if we find young people like Garrett that are ready to take a step toward cure, if not cure, at least ongoing recovery, we need to meet them halfway. We need to meet them halfway by the support of treatment, by the support of creating options that are available, by understanding the relationship between addiction and the criminal justice system, and ultimately by loving our neighbors as ourselves. People sometimes ask me, what's so special about Maine? And I tell them Maine is a small town with very long streets. But it's a small town where we know each other and we care about each other, we think about each other, and we try to help each other. And I think this country can also be a community, should be a community, where we think about and care about each other. Young lives lost, treasure squandered, and hearts broken. I hope that we can start this week to change that tragic trajectory that is breaking so many hearts in this country. And we can make a difference, not for Garrett, but for the young people to whom he was desperately sending this message. We can, we should, and we shall. Thank you, Mr. President. I yield the floor.